Hi class and welcome to another lecture for Intro to Psych. Today we're going to cover Chapter 3, Sensation and Perception, which is going to be a follow-up from Chapter 2. Given that Chapter 2 talked a lot about our nervous system and how it works, right, this idea that it's taking in information, doing something with it, and making an output, we're going to focus on how we get information into the nervous system here by first talking about sensation, so senses. Specifically, we'll be discussing vision. And then perception, how we make sense of those senses, for lack of a better term. We'll finish off the class by talking about attention, how attention is important to all of these components. But as some basics here, we have to kind of define what we're talking about. And one of the most important things to talk about is our senses. So we have senses, which are a system that translates some sort of outside information into neural activity. So our eyes, our ears, our mouth, our nose, things like that. That allows us to get internal information. So those senses give us sensations, a very similar word, but not the same thing. Sensations are these messages that are being taken by our neurons and transmitting that to the brain. So this is the firing of the neurons. And compare that to this idea of perception, making those senses, making that signal into something logical. You hear my voice, you can see me giving this lecture, but it's just the firing of those neurons up until you integrate it in your brain. So sensation is taking that stimuli from your senses, sending it up to your brain, and perception is the processing of that in your brain. And you can see this in a silly example here, where if you look, you might see two people, but if you look more closely, you realize that all this is like a sea urchin and this woman is holding it. There's a silly news article I love to use where this animal was found in a tree and people were wondering what it was. It turns out that it was a croissant. Right, we can not always perceive the world necessarily how it is. We can make mistakes with our perception when we sense or in our sensations here. What's fascinating about this, though, is that our senses aren't always separate. In fact, sometimes they mix together. This is called synesthesia. So this would be the ability to feel colors or sounds, or to taste shapes, or to see colors as certain numbers. And you might say, that's very strange. And this is very uncommon, about 1% of the population. But an example of this is that if I were to show you a picture of 5s and 2s next to each other and ask you to differentiate them, it might take you a little bit. But a person with synesthesia might see the 5s as a different color than the 2 and might be able to perceive these very quickly. Why does this happen? Well, our senses are processed very closely in the brain to one another. And actually, psychotropic drugs like LSD, things like this, can actually mimic this concept of synesthesia. But please, that doesn't mean you should go try LSD. So we have our senses, and some of the basic research on those senses is what we call psychophysics. So this idea of how we understand and perceive these physical stimuli, right? How is it that you can see a stop sign and know to stop? How is it that you can translate this sound wave into music? How is it that we're able to understand what I'm saying? Some other interesting questions in psychophysics are understanding what we're going to call the absolute threshold. This idea of what is the quietest noise that you can hear? What is the lowest amount of light you can see? Or the faintest smell that you're able to smell? Similarly, we can ask questions about this idea of being able to tell when a stimulus has changed. Is it the case that if you were to close your eyes, would you be able to know if somebody turned up the volume on the radio? Would you be able to notice if somebody put something on your backpack? The difference between maybe a feather being added to your backpack or adding a textbook. So when we talk about this first idea, this idea of absolute threshold, this idea of what is the minimum amount of a stimulus that can be detected half of the time? So what is the smallest amount of something that our eyes, ears, nose can detect at least a coin flipped amount? So when it comes to, for instance, seeing a candle, how far away is it that we can see a single candle? Right? It's 20 miles away that we're able to see a single candle, right? This is kind of the idea of, are you able to see a black cat in the dark? Right? It's kind of difficult to do that. Things like sugar, we can taste 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water. That's how sensitive our taste buds are. And we can have information being presented to us below this threshold. For instance, if I'm talking too quiet for you to hear, that information is still being sent, you just don't hear it. And that is what we call subliminal, under the limit, sub-limit threshold. And then we also have supraliminal, so stimuli above this threshold. And so what's fascinating, I always think this is incredible, is that the human eye can detect 5 to 14 photons of light. Photons are the smallest unit of energy that we can do for light. But the sun emits 44 quintillion photons a second. So the idea is that we can take a very, very small amount of light and be able to see it and put it into a supraliminal threshold for us. However, you likely have heard about this idea of subliminal thresholds. Maybe you've heard of this story where a guy said that he put frames in a movie that says, "Go buy Coca-Cola," and supposedly this led to increases in Coke sales. This is not true, right? This is something that's not going to change the way you act. It's not going to make a big difference for you. For instance, if I am a person who doesn't drink Coca-Cola and I see an actual advertisement in the intermission that says, "Go buy Coca-Cola," it's not really going to make me change at a supraliminal threshold. So why would it necessarily make me change at a subliminal threshold? Does this sort of thing still occur? Well, perhaps it does, but does it really work? Not really. It doesn't work any better than your regular advertisements would, right? Putting "buy Coca-Cola" in this movie very subtly is not necessarily going to work better than if you just asked, right, in a regular advertisement, "buy Coca-Cola." We can also talk about this idea of the just noticeable difference, or a difference threshold. So what is the difference threshold that you're able to detect a difference between these stimuli? For instance, if I had you hold out, I don't know, a piece of wood, and you were holding a water bottle on that, and then I had you close your eyes, and I added another water bottle to that, you would probably notice the difference in weight. It would be double the weight. However, would you notice the difference if I added 1 water bottle if you were carrying a case of 30 water bottles, say? Well, probably not. There is what is known as Weber's law of just noticeable difference. So there is a fraction of a stimulus intensity that you will eventually recognize. And we're not going to go into it because it's different percents, but I want you just to really understand this idea that there are certain levels that our nervous system is able to detect that we have made a change, right? I probably wouldn't be able to tell if you turn the volume up on your phone from 0 to 1 if you were on the other side of a football field. But if you were sitting next to me, I probably would notice that. So an example question here for you. Go ahead and read this over and think what you think the answer will be. Alrighty. Hopefully you recognize that Joe, who has the the largest pack, is going to be least likely to feel something added to it. Right? So he is the least likely to notice based on this difference threshold here. Okay. So let's discuss this idea of vision. So there are 5 senses that we have. The only one that we are going to cover in this lecture is going to be vision. So what I want to be able to do is discuss the 5 stages of vision, how we get from sending these light waves into our brain to make sense of them, including the very specific ways in which our eyes collect that info. So when we think about this from a physics perspective, light is just a wave, right? Light is a wavelength that hits our eyes and does something. And depending on what that wavelength is, it changes what colors we see. And right, all of this is done on a set of frequencies here. So in our brains, right, or in our vision system, we have 3 different frequencies that of color that our brains are best able to see. So that is a dark blue kind of color here, a green color here, and a yellowish, reddish, greenish color here. And so if you think about what's going to happen, that wavelength of light is going to hit your eyes. It's going to hit an accessory structure, our eyes, which modify that energy we see. What is going to happen next? A step we're going to spend a lot of time on, transduction. We are going to transduce that wavelength of light into a neuron signal that says fire. So turning that environmental energy into a neuron signal firing, what we talked about in chapter 2. From there, the next 3 steps are very simple and most of what we discussed in the previous chapter. Sensory nerves are going to carry our output from our senses to the central nervous system. So we are going to have the afferent nerves coming into the brain. Those are going to be processed in the thalamus. So this relay center where we are going to connect our movement, our hearing, our vision, and then our sensory cortex. That is going to send that information to where it needs to go, to the occipital lobe to process the vision, to the somatosensory cortex, in order to have those signals be processed. So taking this picture we have here and translating it into visuals, what we have with vision, the first step is that our eye is going to modify this light. So how does this work? Well, you can imagine that if you see something like a beautiful flower, that light wave is going to go into your eye. It's going to end up on the back of your eye. Light is going to enter via your cornea. This is the protective outer layer of your eyes. This is a clear layer. Don't touch your eyes, but this is what you would touch if you did. Behind that cornea is a pupil, which is attached to an iris, right? So the iris is the colored part of our eye, which can grow or shrink, allowing the pupil, the empty hole in the iris, to grow or shrink. So if there's a lot of light outside, our iris will grow and our pupil will contract. We will get very small pupils. They will be very tiny. Why? Because we're getting a lot of light into our eyes. If it's very dark outside, our pupils will contract. They will expand, contract. They will contract. The pupil will expand and it will allow more light to enter the eye. Behind that is our lens. Our lens is going to bend those light rays so they hit the back of the eye and where they need to hit. If you are a person like me who has difficulty with their vision, what are glasses but a different lens out here to help bend these light rays? So some of us might need accommodations for our physical accommodations to help us see. And then finally, those light rays are focused into an image on the back of the eye, which we call the retina, which we'll get into more detail here. If you want a silly little way to remember this, it's caterpillar, CPILR. Light travels, right? If you saw a caterpillar, light would travel from the cornea through the pupil and the iris, past the lens and to the retina. So you could imagine if I asked a question on the exam based on which of the following is not a structure of the eye or an accessory structure of the eye, you should be able to see that it is D, the optic nerve. So that's not something we've talked about yet. Moving on from there, let's discuss how we are transducing this, what we're going to spend the most time on in this section of the chapter. And so this is the idea that we are going to have those light signals hit our rods and cones, and that is going to cause them to fire. So let's look at how the eye works here. Photoreceptors are going to be at the back of the retina, and they are going to detect light. So light is going to come all the way in through the eye. It's going to pass through, you'll notice some of these wired connections, more or less. The light passes through all of these neurons and hits this epithelium, this pigmental epithelium. Don't worry about that. But light is going to bounce off of those into these rods and cones, what we call our photoreceptors. So this is a big important thing here. Photoreceptors are going to be how we see light and color. Now, those will be sent to what we call bipolar cells. So bipolar cells are a combination of some of these, along with ganglion cells, which help us to kind of decide which of these rods and cones to fire. We'll see these talked about later. All of that information, right, after it bounces to the back of the eye, will be sent through this channel, back propagating up to this set of wiring, which sends it to our optic nerve to the next step. So another way to look at this, right, this other image here, that light is going to pass through these cells, bounce off of this pigment here, hit these rods and cones. These bipolar and ganglion cells are going to be kind of passing through here, helping us to make our signals more clear before we send that information off to the optic nerve. Another set of examples here for you if you feel that is helpful. But lastly, I'd like to just show you what this looks like. This is an image of your eye, and here you can see the retina in the very center. This is where all of your rods and cones are going to be focused. Or excuse me, this is your fovea, right here, where most of your rods and cones are focused. Now over here, you can see the optic nerve. This is actually a blind spot in your eye. You won't be able to see anything in this spot. However, you have two eyes, which allows you to see, kind of cover that blind spot up. So, right, you can notice that we have our blood vessels here as well, but more than anything, just pay attention to the fact that this is the outer layer here, and underneath that are our rods and cones. So I've been talking a lot about rods and cones. What are they exactly? Well, rods are going to be these larger photoreceptors, and they are going to be related to just light, whether or not you see light. And what is interesting about them is rods are going to be found, as I back up here, throughout any part of the eye. Any part of the eye here that catches any light is going to have rods and cones. However, they only are detecting light, shadows, basically, if this is white, bright light, or dark. They're mostly in the periphery, because in the center we have our cones. So our cones are going to be three different, there will be three different cones. There will be an S, M, and an L cone. So the small cone, which we also call the blue cone, the medium cone, the green cone, and the L cone, the red cone. Why do we call them that? Well, because they relate to the wavelengths as well as the colors here. So you'll notice that these are mostly in that fovea, as we mentioned. So they are mostly in that specific spot related to these rods and cones, because that is where the majority of our light is going to be focused. So how I like to remember it is that cones, the three cones, are for the three sets of colors, whereas rods are just for light or dark. So with those cones, what is fascinating is we are able to see every single color in the rainbow. And you can see here the three sets of cones that we have, these sets of light that they focus on. If we were to only have two cones, what would that look like? Well, you might not be able to see all the predators, right? This is what deer and boar would see when they are missing the red cone, right? Being unable to see the full set of colors. You might also ask this question, what if we had four cones? Well, some birds have four cones and they can see a little bit more than we can. Some women have four cones, as this tends to be carried on the X gene. I'm not sure why, though, but some women have tetrachromatic vision, four types of vision here. And so this is called the trichromatic color theory, right? So the idea is that we use three colors, three chroma colors, to make light, to make what we perceive as light. So our three types of cones can be mixed in the same way that your screen uses pixels with, what do you know, blue, red, and green in them. And all of these can be used to mix together any type of color that we can see. This helps to explain the theory of color blindness. Why? Well, if you have an issue with one type of cone, this is going to be apparent and you won't be able to see every color. So you'll notice that this theory is going to focus very much on those rods and cones. Now, the next theory of color vision works alongside this previous theory of color vision. These are not two competing theories. But this theory is going to argue that our visual elements are sensitive to color are grouped into three pairs, and that when these cones are firing, they are being paired off into three sets of pairs, and if one set of that pair is firing, the other pair can't. So the example or how we like to explain this, or I like to explain this, I should say, is that you can imagine that if you had two people on a seesaw, only one person can be up at a time. Both people can be equal, yeah, but if one person is up, the other person is down. When one of your colors is firing, the other is not firing. The ganglion cells, as we mentioned before, are saying, right, red is firing, green do not fire. So one set of pairs we have are the red-green pairs, where red and green are being connected here. We also have the blue-yellow pair, where blue and green and red, those combined, can be added together. And then black and white, right? So this dealing of red, green, and blue. So this is a really fascinating thing because what this allows us to do is explain after images. So what I'm going to do to explain this is I'm going to show you something on the next screen. If you pause on the next screen for about 30 seconds, you will be able to look away from your screen and then notice that the colors have changed. So if you go ahead and look at this for about 30 seconds and then look at a wall, you'll notice that the colors have switched. Why is that the case? I'll go ahead and let you pause. So why would those colors have switched? Well, what's the opposite of yellow in this case? Blue. What's the opposite of red? Green. And what's the opposite of black? White. So you get a red, white, and blue as your ganglion cells are firing the other set of neurons. Another example here, another kind of clearer picture of the opponent process theory, it helps explain why, if you look at this picture here, you will see yellow kind of when you are looking at it, when you actually notice that there really is no yellow. Why is that happening? Because blue is firing along with black, and for some reason that is kind of forcing yellow to be fired in the off squares. So another question for you, imagine that you're driving late at night and you see a light out of the corner of your eye. When you directly glance at it, you don't notice it. However, why is this the case? Well, it's because there are more what in your periphery that detect what. There are more tones that detect color. So as a summary, the trichromatic color theory is going to say that we can mix our cones together, and the opponent process theory says that using specific mixing of those cones with the ganglion cells, we are able to create every color that we see. Hopefully that helps you to understand. The book goes through it very well, so if you have any questions as well, you can check that. But moving on here, the next three steps are very simple, right? We're not going to talk too much about this. We know, based on what we've spoken in the last chapter, how nerves fire and send those signals along the afferent chain up to the brain. And then we see that neural energy goes to the thalamus, where this processing occurs. Finally, we send that visual information onto the visual cortex, which we've mentioned is going to be put in the back of the brain. So, mentioning what we talked about in the last chapter, kind of going over this again, you'll notice that our eyes are going to be processed half in one on one side of the brain, half in the other side of the brain, the opposite sides of the brain to be specific, and how that information, once it hits our retinas, hits our photoreceptors, gets sent through the optic chiasm to the thalamus, to the primary vision centers in the occipital cortex. Again, congratulations if you've made it this far. It would be a great time to take a break as we have just finished covering sensation. However, without further ado, we will go ahead and move on to perception. So how do we take our senses and those sensations and do stuff with them? And right, this is something that a lot of people are interested in, right? You can think about optical illusions, how looking at something one way might make you perceive it in a certain way. So perception is the process of making sense out of sensations. Excuse the pun. But this is something that is automatic. This happens without us thinking about it. You may have heard of the cocktail party effect, where if you are standing in a room with a bunch of other people who are just talking and somebody calls your name, you will notice this. You will perceive it and make sense of it very easily. What's the difference between sensation and perception? Well, perception is how you understand what you perceive. So our perceptual organization, our perceptual sets are going to determine how we see the world. So for instance, if I asked you how many legs does this elephant have, if you look, you might all of a sudden be a little bit more confused because it doesn't fit what we might call the likelihood of this. There seem to be extra legs. Or the classic Roman column optical illusion, where we have three columns at the bottom, but only two at the top. Right? What is happening here? This is confusing our perception based on the likelihood. Normally, elephants have 4 legs, and normally a column like this should only have 2. However, we also use a lot of Gestalt characteristics to perceive the world. We use simplicity to make sense of this. Right? We might see a diamond here, even though there is no diamond. Right? Using these subjective contours or perceived edges. This picture over here makes a cube for people. However, we are making subjective contours out of these perceived edges. These are really just circles with a couple lines through them. However, this is a really useful skill for us to have, so don't think I'm just saying poo-poo to the fact that we fall for optical illusions. We also perceive things based on grouping, whether that be by proximity. So you will group things based on how close they are to one another. You might group this picture here into 4 different groups, 2 sets of 2, and then 2 sets of 1. Similarity, you might group objects that are similar together. You group objects together to make a continuous form. Additionally, we group objects together to fill in any missing info. But and a good example of closure here, filling this in, is if I were to, for instance, put my cup in front of my face, you are still able to recognize and fill in the gap that I am a human being. All of this works together with what is known as figure ground processing. So what do you notice and what are you paying attention to? So if you take a look at this picture here, you will probably notice that there are a lot of kitchen instruments here. But did you see the white colored instruments? For instance, this butcher's knife. Or did you notice the black colored instruments? For instance, this mallet here. This is the idea that our brains can change what we're focused on. So you might notice this has the word figure in it. However, in the background, we have the word ground. What do you notice first, though, is what we call the figure, the part of the environment that has meaning to us. Compare that to the background, whatever is going on behind us. For instance, if you are looking at me in the screen, you'll notice that, right, I'm the figure in frame. You're probably not paying attention to what is behind me. If you are paying attention to what is behind me, then that will be your figure here. Some cool examples of figure ground processing, right, showing that you might notice the bats versus the angels first, or this beautiful example of a painting blending our figure in the ground, having this figure kind of float into the background as well. So what's fascinating about this is that our brains, our neurons are firing differences, but we keep this image constant in our mind. For instance, if I were to move backwards, you still know I'm the same thing, even though I'm smaller. If I were to turn sideways, you still know I'm the same thing because I am the same, right? Even though the shape has changed. And even brightness, right? We can change how bright something is. If I were to turn off the lights here, you would still be able to perceive that as me. So again, being able to function with our brains to make sense of the world around us and make those thoughts clear. What is interesting, though, is that we make a 3D map of the world from our two-dimensional eyes, right? If you are only using one eye, it's very difficult here. But we have these binocular cues, the fact that we have two eyes, ocular, two eyes. So one thing that we notice is that things in the distance, far away, converge. So in this picture, you notice what seems far away, these lines converge in the distance as they're very far away. That is because we have this binocular disparity. Our two eyes allow us to spot a difference, just like our two ears allow us to echolocate a sound based on which ear hears it first. We also use a lot of monocular cues, single eye cues. We use a linear perspective that when we see things that are further away, they're harder to read. It's much harder to read my degrees up here than it would be if I brought them close to you. That is because we have a texture gradient. When things are further away, it's harder for us to see the texture, right? You can't see the texture of my hand here versus if I shoved it in your face. Lastly, we also know the idea of interposition. The fact that my microphone is in front of my body lets us know that, it's closer to you. Interestingly, though, just because something's closer doesn't necessarily mean it's in front. I always like to show this because these two images are pretty much the same size, these two little guys down here. But all of this, as we mentioned, is explained through this Gestalt processing, this idea that this whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that we are able to use our functional brain to adapt and make sense of the world. So how do we recognize the world? Well, there's two different ways that we can use to recognize the world when we get this information. And these two ways are bottom-up processing and top-down processing. So bottom-up processing is the idea that you are going to take what your senses are sending you, those sensations, and use that to understand the world. Okay, that sounds like what people normally do. Sure, but in reality, a lot of what we do is called top-down processing. We have certain beliefs or ideas about what is happening, and we use those to make sense of our world. For instance, if you have ever been in a situation where you can't really hear what somebody said, and so, they make noises to you, and your senses hear those noises, and you hear that, and they say, hey, can you blah, 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 blah. And you go, what is it? And maybe you see them point to their watch. And so what you're able to do there is your bottom-up processing, your senses weren't able to get you all the info. You said, hey, can you blah, blah, blah. Well, you don't know what that means. So you might use info that you've known from previous experiences. When people point to their watch, they want to know the time. So you might think, oh, what that person was saying is, hey, can you tell me the time? So this is the idea of taking sensory information and how do we choose to use it? Are we using these kind of logical leaps in this top-down processing, or are we just kind of going at it with our bottom-up senses here? So this, at the bottom-up processing level, uses what we call feature detectors, certain cells in our brain that recognize certain features of an item. right? For instance, you can break up the letter D in our brain into a couple different features here. You can break it up into the far line here, as well as the backward C component. And maybe there are certain neurons in our eyes that are better at detecting lines that are straight up and down. And maybe there are certain neurons that are better at detecting, right, this backward C feature. Similar with a triangle, right? There are certain maybe neurons that help us to detect these better and understand what we are seeing. Okay, sure, man, whatever you say. Well, let me give you an example. So if I ask you to count the number of C's here, you have to use bottom-up processing, right? You have to look at each of these because the features of each of these are very similar. G's, Q's, C's, they all contain that kind of C curve, or backwards for me. D, on the other hand, has the reverse of it, but that's kind of tough. How about if I asked you to count the number of C's here? Oh, that's a lot easier. Why? Because your feature detectors are not looking at the same features and overfiring here. So this is the idea that the stimulus first is being analyzed by our basic features, and so we're using that to make sense of the world. This other example we have here is, right, if you have a stomach ache, maybe the way that you analyze or understand that is, ow, my tummy hurts. And so you think about why that happens. That is different than what we call top-down processing. So using our past experiences to understand stimuli. So maybe cutting the corners a little bit here. For instance, if you look at this letter here, you might think it is an A or an H. Sure. Turns out it's both. How can it be both? Well, what we expect it to be makes an important distinction here, right? So this is able to kind of in our brains be two separate letters at once because it fits with our past experience. An example of this is if I show you this object, what do you think it is? How about now, if I give you some top-down processing to help you? You might be able to see that this is something you would use in the morning. Now, which do we use more? Well, it's a team effort. Look at this. What do you see? Well, depends on what's around it. This example here is a manger scene. However, you might also notice that these look like two T-Rex mouths. And this in the center would not be Jesus, but a table saw. Maybe, maybe not. Now, this relates to a very cool power that humans have, pareidolia. So pareidolia is the fact that we are very motivated as humans to put a top-down schema of a face specifically on something. So if you go to look at the clouds, our brains are trying to fit patterns from a top-down perspective on what we think those are. Maybe you've heard of the face on Mars, right? That in the past, right, we saw this picture and maybe saw a face here. When we look at the HD face on Mars, it's a lot harder to justify that as a face. This example here where a grilled cheese sandwich was sold on eBay for 25 grand because it was claimed that there is a image of the Virgin Mary here, an eye, a nose, and a mouth. I don't know. I don't really see it. I can see Toast Malone though. Anyways. The final thing we're going to discuss is attention, because this kind of all underlies what we've talked about so far of sensation and perception. If you're sensing something, but you're not paying attention to it, are you noticing it? If this video is on in the background and you're not paying attention to what I'm saying, are you really perceiving it? No. So when we focus our attention on something, that allows us to notice it. It allows us to put mental energy towards it. And however, it takes effort. Using attention is something that is also limited. You can't necessarily have unlimited attention. You can't pay attention to everything all at once. Now, when it comes to attention, oftentimes we focus on overt attention when we ask somebody to look at something, Or when my daughter says, "Hey, daddy," and I look at her and I say, "Hi, how are you?" Covert attention is something you maybe have done in the past. Covert attention is the idea of not noticeably moving or changing what you do. Maybe this is if you're on the bus, you hit pause on your music so you can listen to somebody's fight. Maybe this is the idea that you just kind of, move your eyes or, try not to be caught by something. Divided attention, on the other hand, this idea of multitasking is something that you almost certainly cannot do. I can't do it myself. Multitasking is the true idea of multitasking, being able to do two things at once, like write and read different things, is available to only 5% of people, because this is consciously completing two tasks at once. When I'm singing and driving, on the other hand, my driving is an automatic process. It's not a conscious process. It's something that's being dealt with outside of my full attention. Right? This is the idea of automatic attention here. And so one type of automatic attention we'll talk about here is what we call the Stroop task. And so the Stroop task is a very simple task here. The first part is for you to just look at these words on the screen and read them out loud. So the first word here is purple. Right. That shouldn't be too hard for you to do. However, what if I asked you, instead of saying the word purple for the first word, you had to tell me the color that each word was written in? So the first one would be red, the second blue, and the third green. How fast can you do that? Probably pretty poorly. Why? Well, attention for us, our brains have been taught how to read, and we pay attention to all the letters in a word. And so when we are having conflicting information, pay attention to the color, but don't pay attention to what's written. Well, we've spent years of our lives learning how to read. Hopefully you know how to read, and that is going to allow us to have these conflicts of attention. But if you are a Spanish speaker, right, you might have issues with this. I'm not going to have issues in attention with this because I'm not a Spanish speaker, French, and a poor French speaker at that. So you'll notice that, right, if you asked me to just read the font color of this words, it would take me a lot less. It will be a lot less trouble than if I were to be a Spanish speaker, because those two types of attention, that automatic attention, is not being processed. So are we able to ignore irrelevant information? Well, sometimes, right? If you ask people to look at this scene and pick the two differences between this, right, you maybe are able to notice some of them. But we might also become blind to unattended information. We might get what is known as inattentional blindness. So if I am not listening to my daughter, if I'm watching a video on my phone and she says, "Dad, Dad, Dad," I'm just not even going to know she said anything, right? It's not that I'm not paying attention to her, it's that I didn't even hear her. Now, due to copyright concerns, I am not going to play this video. However, if you haven't seen this, I highly suggest you type in Count the Passes and Gorilla and go watch this online. But I think the video has a version of it. Another great one, and again, I am not going to get caught here. You can go ahead and see these on your PowerPoints as well. But the last thing to cover here is the idea of change blindness. So we might not even notice that something has changed because we didn't pay attention to anything here. So for instance, if I would have changed my shirt throughout this video, I did not, you probably wouldn't have noticed it. Why wouldn't you have noticed it? Because you weren't paying attention to it. You were blind to that change because it wasn't something you bothered to notice. This video here is, again, probably a copyright concern, so I'm not going to play it. But in this video, what happens is a person asks for directions before they create a situation where the two people talking are split apart for a moment, and they switch out who is talking to this person. They switch it out from a white man, to an Asian female. A white man asks, "Can you tell me directions?" This switcheroo happens, and then this person gives directions to an Asian female without even recognizing that they were speaking originally to a white man. We can be very blind to these things. And so the kind of end of this lecture falls on the fact that our sensations and perceptions are all underlied by this idea of attention. But that is everything we have to cover here. If you do have any questions, please let me know, but I hope you all are well. And if there's anything I can do to help you, let me know. Hope you all do well. Have a great day.